The air ambulance industry is supposed to exist to save lives, but sometimes, due to a myriad of reasons, the air ambulance industry actually costs lives. When something goes wrong, the cause is rarely just a single mistake. It's usually the end of a terrible chain of events, a flawed Swiss cheese model that I've spoken about on this channel time and time again. And that terrible chain of events is constructed from decisions, policies, training, and pressure. In this episode, we're going to take a look at the 2007 fixed-wing air ambulance crash of Southwest Medevac, not to assign blame, as usual, but to understand what the evidence tells us and how many of the factors in this accident are still prevalent across the air medical industry today. And in addition, probably for the first time on this channel, we're going to take a quick look at whether or not this patient even required an air ambulance in the first place. Stick around for the full story on this episode of the Dr. Medic. Now, the operator involved in this incident was Enchantment Aviation, which operated locally under the brand name Southwest Medevac. Now, Southwest Medevac had been in operation since 1995, but just 13 days before this crash, the company was acquired by Omniflight Helicopters. Now, Omniflight itself later came under the control of Air Group Holdings, which was ultimately acquired by Air Methods in 2011 in a deal valued at approximately $200 million. Now, at the time of this accident, Southwest Medevac operated, just under maybe a dozen helicopters and 2 fixed-wing aircraft with a workforce of just over about 100 employees. And several years after this crash, Omniflight experienced what can only be described as a deeply troubling safety record. Within a span of 6 months, the company was associated with 4 separate air ambulance accidents: a helicopter striking utility poles at a hospital in South Carolina, a pilot that ran out of fuel mid-flight in Arizona. Just 3 days after that, another crash in South Carolina that killed the entire crew. And then, a few months later, a deadly helicopter crash in El Paso, Texas. Now, if that one sounds familiar, it should, because I previously covered that last Southwest Medevac accident involving the helicopter pilot who received severely inadequate training, had significant vision problems, and was nevertheless medically cleared to fly, before ultimately crashing an A-Star 350 into the ground on a super clear night, killing himself and the 2 flight paramedics that were aboard. That earlier episode will be linked in the description below. Now, the aircraft in this accident was this Beechcraft King Air E90B, a twin-engine turboprop widely used in air ambulance operations with tail number November 369 Charlie Delta. Now, this King Air was built in 1975 and it had accumulated a total of 10,358 hours. Now, this aircraft did have a functioning ELT and it was outfitted with 2 Pratt & Whitney PT6A 28 turboprops, each making about 680 horsepower. Now, the King Air family is used extensively in air ambulance operations all around the world, mainly due to its reliability. It can fit, equipment like stretchers through the doors, which is important. It's efficient and, unfortunately, at least in my opinion, can be operated by a single pilot in all conditions, even for air ambulance use. The pilot in this accident was 56-year-old Ricky Byers. He was seated in the left of the cockpit and was the only pilot on board. Now, Ricky held a commercial pilot certificate with an instrument rating for airplane and held a Class II medical certification without waivers or any limitations. He had a total of 2,775 hours in all aircraft, but just 23 hours in the King Air E90B, with most of those hours occurring during training at Southwest Medevac. Now, the weather was pretty nice this night, and this airport was well known to be pretty clear most of the time. The temperature was 22 degrees Celsius with a dew point of 18 degrees Celsius, with scattered clouds at 7,000 feet, and visibility was way over 10 miles. Now, this sequence of events takes place in the state of New Mexico in the southwestern part of the United States. The base for this pilot and med crew was located in Roswell, New Mexico. Yes, that Roswell. The patient's hospital as well as the pickup airport were located about 75 miles to the west in the small mountain town of Ruidoso. And the destination hospital for the patient was located about 155 miles to the northwest in the great city of Albuquerque. Now, earlier in the day, on August 5th, 2007, the flight paramedic, the flight nurse, and a daytime pilot were at their base located again in Roswell, New Mexico. Now, the day pilot, he received a flight request to pick up a patient in Ruidoso, New Mexico, but they were on eternal delay because they could not find a destination hospital to accept that patient. However, that patient that they were going to pick up earlier in the day from Ruidoso was not actually the patient on the accident flight. It was a lady named Mary, and Mary was actually the wife of Ray Nunley, who was the mayor of Ruidoso, who was needing transport to a cardiac center up in Albuquerque after she had a heart attack. But as I said, there were no rooms available and they couldn't get her accepted. Now keep that in mind that she was having a heart attack, arguably one of the most time-sensitive emergencies that any EMS crew might transport, whether by ground or by air. Just keep that in mind. So Mary, though, while she was waiting for her room, was actually sharing a hospital room at this small hospital with the patient that was actually on the accident flight later that day. And that patient was 15-month-old young lady named Lily Smith. Well, why was Lily Smith in the hospital? Well, her mother, Tracy, later stated that she had taken Lily to the emergency room earlier in the evening for a seizure, and that she was quite frustrated with the emergency room physician because I guess the physician basically sent her home and said that the physician made her feel like an idiot and that she must not know what she was talking about in regards to her daughter's seizure. And so Tracy, did what the physician said, took Lily home. But then I guess about 45 minutes later, while she was playing with her daughter, Lily appeared to have another seizure. I guess she turned blue, and then she called 911 and was transported back to the emergency room. Now, it was then that the emergency room physician called for air transport to fly Lily and her mother to Albuquerque for ongoing care for seizures, I guess. But first, they both needed to be transported by ground ambulance from Lincoln County Medical Center to Sierra Blanca Airport, where they would rendezvous with the Southwest Medevac airplane that would be flying in from Roswell. Once at the airport, the patient would then be transferred from the ground ambulance crew over to the flight crew, who would load the patient and her mother into the King Air and make the short 40-minute flight up to Albuquerque. Well, I'm not really giving anything away and stating that all 5 of the people on this aircraft died in this crash, but if that's the case, if everybody died, how was Lily's mother able to tell the story that I just told you? Well, you see, even though this base was located in Roswell, New Mexico, the pilot for this aircraft, Ricky Byers, actually lived in Ruidoso with his wife. And so, I guess it would not be uncommon that if Ricky flew into Ruidoso, that he might ask his wife to meet him there at the airport so that they could see each other for a few minutes during downtime that they might have. Remember, they're probably working like 7 days on and 7 days off, so maybe he's gone 7 days at a time. I don't know. But it certainly seems common enough that a fixed-wing aircraft might land at an airport like this and might have to wait maybe 10 minutes, 30 minutes, or maybe even a couple hours for the ambulance crew to arrive with the patients on board. So when the ambulance did arrive, the flight nurse and the flight paramedic were working with the ground ambulance crew to transfer care of this little 15-month-old girl from the ground ambulance crew and their whole stretcher system and getting the patient loaded up onto the aircraft, which can be quite a task, especially in a small aircraft like a King Air 90. Now, during this time, though, the pilot's wife was talking with Tracy, again, who is the patient's mother, and that is when Tracy tells the pilot's wife the story about dealing with the rude physicians back at the hospital, and the pilot's wife seemed, very concerned. She tried to comfort the mother by actually telling her that she was in the hands of the best pilot and the best medical crew. So once everybody was aboard the plane, which included the pilot, the flight paramedic, the flight nurse, the patient Lily, and her mother Tracy, the pilot starts the engines up and then attempts to taxi out, but then he realizes that he can't taxi out because he's taxiing against the chalks. The aircraft was still chalked. I feel like that's kind of like a strike 1. Maybe it was strike 2. I don't know. We'll kind of come back to that. Anyway, they moved the chalks out of the way, was able to move on. A few minutes later, at about 21:30, the pilot's wife then watched as the aircraft, on a perfectly clear night, made what appeared to be a normal departure from runway 6 to the northeast, and then was able to watch as the plane disappeared, but stated that she could see that the plane did make kind of a slight turn to the left towards the north. But just moments after the pilot's wife lost sight of the aircraft turning towards the north, the direction of this aircraft drastically changed. Now, Sierra Blanca Airport sits at an elevation of 6,814 feet above sea level, nestled up in the Sacramento and Capitan Mountains, which are a part of this kind of the southernmost part of the Rocky Mountains, and this airport is surrounded by mountains that range with different peaks that range from 8,500 feet to 10,500 or 11,000 feet. And so there really isn't any radar coverage in this area, at least at the time, until aircraft climb up above about 11,000 feet. Now, this aircraft did have Sky Connect, which was a pretty primitive satellite-based flight tracking system at the time that only transmitted the position of an aircraft every 30 seconds for a helicopter, but only every 5 minutes for a fixed-wing aircraft. And in this case, the Sky Connect only transmitted a single position throughout this flight, and that was at 21:37, which was just a few minutes after takeoff, and showed an altitude of 6,811 feet with an airspeed of just 115 knots, and was tracking a course of 72 degrees, which obviously is not to the north of the runway. Now, let's just make sure I said that right and that you heard that right. The only position that was transmitted was just 3 or 4 minutes after this airplane took off, and actually showed an altitude of 3 feet below the level of the actual airport that they just took off from, and only with an airspeed of just 115 knots. This aircraft obviously never made it to its destination in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and soon thereafter, about 25 to 30 minutes later, dispatchers for Southwest Medevac called Sierra Blanca Airport to notify them that the accident airplane was overdue. They were unable to pick up an ELT signal, and there was no indication of where this aircraft was. However, just a few moments after this airplane took off, there was another plane actually that was inbound for runway 24, and both the pilot and the co-pilot on that aircraft later stated that they saw a large fireball about the size of a house just off the nose of their aircraft while they were still on final for runway 24. But they were still not able to find the wreckage until search and rescue personnel located it at about 0500 the next morning, about 4 miles, yes, just 4 miles southeast of the airport. 56-year-old pilot Ricky Byers, 44-year-old flight nurse Brian Miller, 40-year-old flight paramedic Deanna Palmer, 15-month-old Lily Smith, and her mother Tracy Smith all died in this accident. Now, flight nurse Brian Miller had only been with Southwest Medevac for about 6 months at the time, and previously functioned as a volunteer paramedic for 11 years with the Denver City, Texas Volunteer Fire Department. The flight paramedic Deanna was hired with Southwest Medevac just a few weeks before this accident and had just completed new hire orientation. In this accident flight, it was just her 3rd flight as a flight paramedic. Now, she previously worked as an ER tech and a paramedic in Prescott Valley, Arizona, as well as serving in the United States Army. Now, accident site pictures are clear that the aircraft was on a heading away from Albuquerque on a heading of 72 degrees with a descent angle of 13 degrees, which means that this pilot was flying the airplane in a gradual downward angle just above the trees on a downward slope of a hill, and eventually started to impact trees. And this aircraft, it simply just came apart over a distance of about 1,100 feet, culminating in a large flash fire. So, what happened? Well, this investigation quickly and very conclusively ruled out any engine failure or propeller malfunction, as well as any fuel contamination or mechanical or maintenance defects. Now, based on the wreckage examination and test, the engines were obviously producing power and the aircraft was controllable all the way up until impact. The investigation therefore centered on operational decision-making, procedural deviation, and risk management. This was not an unexplained accident, and as we will find, it was an operational incident that was 100% preventable. Investigators quickly zeroed in on the culture at Southwest Medevac. We've probably heard that before. Now, up until this point, Southwest Medevac had been in operation for about 12 years, and I don't believe that they had any fatal crashes up until this point. Now, they had two fixed-wing bases, one with a Cessna 414 and one where they flew the King Air E90 at the time, which was this base out of Roswell, and there were 4 pilots at that base. The NTSB did extensive interviews with the remaining pilots as well as the chief pilot and check airmen, and every one of them said, and they seemed to be on the same page, that they never really felt corporate pressure to fly and that the culture was very safe. So investigators then focused on the training of the fixed-wing pilots. Now, like I said before, Pilot Ricky was hired with Southwest Medevac in June of 2006 specifically to fly the Cessna 414 and was later upgraded to the King Air 90 in April of 2007. Now, if a pilot doesn't already have a bunch of time in a certain airframe, they typically can't just jump into that other aircraft and be checked off on it. They have to complete ground school or maybe differences training or some type of transition training to go from one aircraft to another. And in this case, the transition training into a King Air 90 was 16 hours of ground training, and the FAA requires that for a single pilot flying in Part 135 operations, that there is a minimum of 6 hours of flight training when transitioning to another aircraft. And during interviews, while the check airman did note that the flight training was a minimum of 6 hours and usually took more time than that for a pilot to be comfortable on a check ride, the documentation actually showed that Pilot Ricky somehow completed his flight training in just 5.2 hours. We have to remember that this flight was taking place at night under VFR conditions in mountainous terrain. They are flying in a King Air 90, which is obviously fully IFR capable, and it was stated that the company policy was for pilots to use standard IFR procedures and follow the published departure procedures for airports if they were available. Now, oftentimes at these small mountain airports, there may only be one safe way in and one safe way out. And the departure procedures for any given airport, especially these smaller airports like this, are designed to specify initial climb directions. They might mandate minimum climb gradients, and they often will require early turns away from rising terrain. There's all kinds of things that could be on these procedures. And if these procedures are followed, the aircraft will remain above all known obstacles, even if the pilot cannot see them. Now remember, this airport is already at nearly 7,000 feet, and these engines, they're going to be producing less power. The propellers are going to be less efficient. Their climb performance is going to be degraded on some level. And these departure procedures, especially the obstacle part of the procedures, are designed to assume not ideal conditions, but realistically the worst case climb performance. And they are supposed to be designed so that even a marginally performing aircraft can still clear terrain if done correctly and the departure procedure is followed. Now, yes, the weather was great and they were flying in visual conditions, but we got to remember that night visual conditions in mountainous terrain carries many of the same risks as instrument conditions, such as black hole illusion, degraded depth perception, loss of visual horizon, and really most notably in this situation, rising terrain that is invisible until it's too late. So, departure procedures, specifically, like I said, obstacle departure procedures exist solely for terrain and obstacle clearance and are developed and published in order to provide a proven, surveyed escape path that keeps pilots clear of terrain when they can't see it. Now, these particular obstacle departure procedures, it has lots of information on it here that includes, trees and signs and poles and all that. But what I want to focus on here are the actual departure route descriptions. You can see that there are 4 descriptions here because there are 4 runways. You've got 6, 1, 2, 2, 4, and 3, 0. And all 4 of these descriptions are essentially requiring the same exact final pathway out of these mountains, and that is to fly the aircraft to the non-directional beacon, or NDB, called Capitan, which is essentially an old technology, low-frequency radio beacon that the aircraft's navigation equipment can detect. They can turn it on and then fly straight towards it. They should then, once they get to that beacon, turn towards 90 degrees or due east and continue climbing due east until they reach 11,000 feet, which will be pretty quick. which would ensure that they are then clear of all the obstacles, and then they can proceed on whatever their original route or course was. Now, in this case, their original course would have been Albuquerque, which would have been back to the northwest. Now, it was documented that it was company policy at Southwest Medevac to use standard IFR procedures, as all of their fixed-wing operations were conducted as IFR flights, and that all pilots were supposed to follow the published departure procedures if they were available. So to be clear though, how was that departure procedure supposed to be conducted in this case? Well, the pilot, Ricky Byers, he would typically, if you're following their policy, would file an IFR plan while on the ground, and then while taxiing out to the runway, would activate that flight plan with the Albuquerque Center. Now, regardless of where the rest of the flight plan went, and regardless of which runway they took off from, all flights out of Sierra Blanca would have the aircraft flying to this Capitan beacon and then turning to the east to 11,000 feet. And if you were taking off from runway 6, like Ricky was in this case, the pilot really doesn't even have to do much. They kind of are proceeding directly east almost to Capitan and then turning true 90 degrees to the east and climbing to 11,000 feet, and then off they go. And really, these departure procedures should be followed. Again, whether they're flying IFR or VFR, they should still be followed. And the only difference would be that either they would be following their IFR plan, with ATC and stuff like that, or maybe they're flying a GPS departure, or they would be following literally this 100-year-old technology with a non-directional beacon and simply flying to the beacon and turning to the east. But none of that happened on this night. None of it. Why not? First, if it was VMC, and even though this company procedures were to activate their IFR flight plans, it was well documented at Southwest Medevac that quite often pilots would just never activate their IFR plan and instead fly these flights VFR, which, I don't want to say that's unheard of, but I don't think that today, 2026, I don't think that today there are very many, if any, documented fixed-wing air ambulance programs in the United States that are currently and routinely ditching their IFR plans to fly VFR. But okay, it was routine for Southwest Medevac at the time to cancel the IFR flight plans and fly VFR. No big deal, right? They've got experienced pilots, all good. Just continue to follow the departure plan and all will be good, right? Well, unfortunately, no. Because at Southwest Medevac, it was also documented that not only would these pilots routinely fail to activate their IFR flight plans, they would also fail to follow these obstacle departure procedures and just do whatever it was that they thought was best. It was quoted, and I quote, that most pilots did not want to waste time executing the entire published departure procedure because it would take too much time to execute, especially when they needed to get a patient to the hospital. If they didn't follow the departure procedures, what did they do to clear the obstacles? Well, it was stated that pilot Ricky Byers, this is from people who flew with him, would routinely fly towards the city of Lincoln, which is sort of just to the east of Capitan. And then instead of turning 90 degrees due east and climbing to 11,000 feet, he would instead turn southeast and fly along this highway here through the Hondo Valley. And sometimes pilots would fly east out of this airport and then look out to see the Fort Stanton lights to the west, which was an indicator to turn right and again follow this Hondo Valley after they, quote, clear the rocks. Obviously those methods worked many times before this night. And in all honesty, in 2007, I hate to say it, but it was probably quite common for air ambulance pilots to ditch their IFR plans and fly VFR. But these methods all rely on one big factor, and that is the ability to visually look out of the aircraft and see those Fort Stanton lights, or see the horizon, or see those rocks that you're trying to clear. Again, aviation safety data, this is published data and training materials show that nighttime VFR flights over mountainous terrain significantly increases the risk of controlled flight into terrain because pilots, they can still lose visual contact with rising ground and horizon cues. And not following those procedures, which is not necessarily, maybe an at-risk or reckless decision by pilot Ricky Byers, because the culture that he worked in and was trained in told him that these were the acceptable decisions to make. And in the end, all of the data clearly points to the fact that Pilot Ricky was trying to turn to the east, more to the southeast, most likely to follow his previous Hondo Valley departure route and not the Capitan route. He lost reference with the horizon and slowly descended the aircraft until the airplane started to impact trees. He tried to recover, but the aircraft completely came apart over a span of about a quarter mile and ultimately ended in a massive fireball, killing all 5 people on board. You know, when mistakes happen in a just culture, which should exist in all air ambulance operations, leadership must make a decision on how to respond to errors that occur. Was this reckless behavior that is, managed through punitive action, or was it at-risk behavior, which is managed through removing incentives for such at-risk behavior in the first place? Or was this a human error, which it was, that is managed through processes and training and changes of procedures? I'm going to go with the last one because it was Southwest Medevac that trained Ricky Byers, and it is very clear from post-accident interviews that they normalized the deviation of normal operating procedure and even documented that part of the reason for this increased risk was to decrease flight time for the patient. And we should all know at this point that that should not have any bearing on necessarily the speed or route that you're going to fly, but more on that soon. But for now, what was the NTSB's probable cause? Failure to maintain clearance from terrain due to spatial disorientation. It left out everything else I just told you, but in other words, Pilot Ricky most likely lost visual reference cues to the horizon and either thought he was turning one way or thought he was flying straight, but was actually turning to the right and descending, and due to being spatially disoriented, flew the aircraft into the side of this hill. So what would have prevented this? Well, it seems pretty obvious that simply following the departure procedures on an IFR plan would have prevented this. Southwest Medevac appeared to have a culture that was a bit more laid back and gave their pilots quite a bit of freedom to deviate from company policy. And back then in 2007, maybe that worked for a pilot who has flown in and out of this airport a million times and has 15,000 hours. But Pilot Ricky, at the ripe old age of 56, had just 2,700 hours of flight time and with just a few hours in the King Air 90. Now, is 2,700 hours a lot of time? Well, maybe for some jobs, but to put that into perspective, as of the date of this recording, many of the largest air ambulance operators in the United States require a minimum of 2,500 hours in fixed wing just to get hired in the first place. So, I'm not saying that the pilot was necessarily a rookie pilot or something like that, but he certainly was green to this service. He had the minimum amount of hours that could possibly be required to be an air ambulance pilot. He was definitely inexperienced in this aircraft and was apparently, according to the documentation, never monitored or observed on any check ride into Sierra Blanca Airport, which they said was a problem airport. Yet he was given the freedom to deviate from published departure procedures and from flying IFR, which ultimately led to Pilot Ricky becoming spatially disoriented and flying a perfectly good aircraft into the trees and killing 5 people. Now, many of you will probably also chime in, which I kind of alluded to at the beginning, and say that a second pilot would have prevented this. And while the obviousness in the logic of the claim that a second pilot would have prevented this, it certainly stands out, but there's not really any documented evidence to prove that that's true. That doesn't mean it's not true. It just means that there's no empirical data to support that, as there is evidence and statistics to show that spatial disorientation can occur with even 2 pilots and still get everybody killed. A most recent example would be that Mexican air ambulance crash, that Learjet crash out of Philadelphia, which was a Mexican flight crew going back to Mexico, which appeared to be a spatial disorientation crash, and there were 2 pilots sitting up front on that one. Now, I said I would get to the patient, and not to stir up the world's most controversial topic when it comes to air ambulances, but let's stir it up, because it's a big, giant elephant in the room that no one ever seems to talk about out in the open. We don't talk about it at conferences. We don't talk about it in our emails and our company meetings. You call, we haul. So let's just skim the surface and see how this goes, okay? So now, in short, there are very few, this is a big one for you, there are very few situations where the speed of the aircraft getting to the final destination plays any role in improved outcomes of the patient. Now, there are obviously some. Priority 1 traumas requiring surgery is one. Acute STEMIs, otherwise known as heart attacks, is another. Acute ischemic strokes is a third, but the overall majority of what flight crews fly and transport in this country are not those things. Many of them are ICU patients being transferred between facilities who require the critical care of a competent critical care nurse and or a critical care flight paramedic. It is likely that future research could show that the benefits that most air ambulance crews provide, which they do provide benefits, is not getting that patient to the hospital quicker, but rather the benefit comes from that crew getting to the patient quick and then stabilizing and managing that patient at a high level of care. Now, in this case, though, it's possible that neither of those mattered. This was a 15-month-old with seizures, and to the layperson, that sounds terrible. Seizures are terrible, and it's a 15-month-old. However, we will obviously never know the cause of Lily's seizures. Now, they could have been caused by a fever, they could have been caused by a tumor or meningitis or some undiagnosed epilepsy. Who knows? But what we should know is that it certainly was not a time-sensitive call, at least not in terms of getting that patient to the hospital in Albuquerque. Rarely do we get a good picture of the medical condition of many of these patients who die in these air ambulance crashes. And in this case, while we do have the information related to the patient's seizures, we obviously don't have, a full in-depth history and physical exam. But I feel like I'm not going too far out on a limb here that based on my opinion, it was an absolute waste of resources to utilize an air ambulance to transport a toddler with seizures, which can easily be managed with proper airway control and pharmacological control. What the 15-month-old needed for transport was a competent critical care med crew, and in this case with the flight nurse and the flight paramedic. And in all honesty, to be honest with you, there really should be no situation in a seizure with this patient that could not be managed by a competent ground paramedic on a 911 ambulance, and even if it was over a period of an hour or two. And before somebody jumps in and says, well, maybe there wasn't a paramedic on the ground there, I don't think that that's a good enough excuse. Just because there's nobody on the ground is not always the greatest reason to risk everybody's life just to get somebody where they need to go. But again, more on that in a future episode. But in this accident, we have 5 lives lost and countless others destroyed due to the loss of their loved ones. And for what? To get a stable toddler to a hospital to manage seizure activity? There is no doubt. The data is clear that the air ambulance industry, both in America and across the world, it does save lives when used appropriately. And this story about Southwest Medevac and this fatal crash is not unique to this particular crash, and it has happened time and time again, and it still occurs today. I read every email and answer every phone call and message that you send me. It takes me a while, but I read them all, and I share this story not to place blame, but to emphasize and point out how we need to have a better understanding of how the risk is becoming far too routine. Far too routine. Here's the big question that's really going to mess with your brains. Which air ambulance service in the United States will be the first service to include patient condition as part of their risk analysis? Does that even matter? Because we don't do that today. Like I said, it's you call, we haul. We don't turn down flights because somebody doesn't need the aircraft. You call, these aircraft are coming. Is that the right thing to do? Are air ambulances flying patients each and every day across the country who 100% do not need a helicopter or an airplane? Before I publish that story and run with that fully dedicated to that topic, I wonder what the general public thinks. I wonder how the flight crews across the country feel and the pilots. I wonder what you think watching this right now. Is the air ambulance industry being abused by flying patients who do not need the resource in the first place? Do those critical patients that I mentioned earlier, is the big one, like priority 1 traumas and STEMIs and strokes, when they need a helicopter, do they sometimes suffer and have to wait longer because the helicopter or airplane that would have picked them up instead got called to fly an elderly septic patient instead? Again, does that even matter? I ask the question to you. Let me know in the comments below, or if you want to remain anonymous, visit my website and send me an email. Until then, more to come on this topic in the future for sure. Like I said, until then, be safe. Please make good decisions. Say something nice to somebody today, and I'll see you on the next one.